is modern Maputo in Mozambique. Um, and yeah, so a lot of it is based on these kind of very journalistic writings that Craveirinha put out about the growth of football in the city. The second biggest source that I would say that the text draws on is the use of these kind of government records and other additional non-Craveirinha press sources that are used in a variety of ways. In government records, we're looking a lot at things that are attached to education and schooling. And with a lot of the press sources, we're talking about the results of football games and also the development of the style of play in the city that became very distinct, which we'll hit on a little bit later. Lastly, and I wish it was used a lot more, there were a few select oral interviews that were part of the book. I really wish those would have formed more of the historical narrative, as I think it would have made it easier to read, but I'll get to that part in the critique section, I guess. Now I'll just kind of move on to talking about Domingos's framework and providing a brief synopsis of the text itself. And I think that in thinking about Domingos's writing in this book, we can kind of narrow it down, the sections, the many, many sections of the book, into these three delineations. And so we have here football as performance and community. We have football in the city in which it's played, in this case, Lourenço Marques. And then we also have football as representative of a particular historical experience. And of course, in this particular experience, the experience of colonialism. And so I'll run through some of the general argument of the book now and how it might fit into these three categories will, I think, become apparent. Obviously, there's quite a bit of overlap in all of these things, and so I won't necessarily point it out at each chapter I'm talking about. But really, the first few chapters of the book focus in on explaining the growth of football in the city. And Domingos, I think, is really strong in this section. I think it's some of the best writing. And he notes that the game is actually initially brought to the country by the internationally traveled elites, the kind of national bourgeoisie. And they even pushed for it to be incorporated into the physical education curriculum of the most prestigious schools in the city. Despite this kind of upper class bourgeoisie beginning, it quite quickly had a more organic growth in the urban periphery and the kind of suburbs that Domingos is really focusing in for much of the text. And it was ultimately in these populations in the periphery that the kind of distinctive city style of play that Domingos spends a lot of attention on would grow. And Domingos, working heavily in this section from Craveirinha's writings, characterizes this kind of city style, regional style, as, quote, cunning, unquote, and containing, quote, a sense of malice, unquote. And that sense of malice, he doesn't define as being evil in any way, but just that players had a real sense of trying to embarrass opponents. And they would favor embarrassing opponents with a flashy dribble over making, an easy pass to a teammate at times. And that's where this kind of sense of malice or evil comes in. It's really, I didn't think the best word to describe that style of play, but again, we'll get to critiques. And he links the growth of this style of play and characterizes it as very entertaining. And he links the kind of entertaining nature of the way that the game is played in this street culture. He links that to the growth of a strong fan culture. And you have this huge following springing up in the first few chapters around these really pretty informal games. And they amass, really hundreds and thousands of spectators for these very small, at times, neighborhood matches. And I think that his documenting of this growth is really one of the more interesting parts of the book. And as this spectator culture grows, the actual participation of spectators in the matches becomes really, really important. And this is particularly as spectators kind of begin to infuse local cultural practices into those games. And this includes what Domingos calls, quote, witchcraft. He talks about witchcraft being incorporated into the games. And so there's some really fun anecdotes in this section about specially concocted teas that would poison opposing teams, or the appearance of white and black birds around the field, with each of those birds representing the total number of goals that would be scored by each team. And again, this is a really interesting section where Domingos is working off of these kind of local practices being incorporated into the actual game. And he talks a little bit about the way that this practice of witchcraft around the games actually influences the style. And this is what really defines that local, entertaining, uh, so-called malicious style of play, is this kind of fusion of the way that football's played just uh, amongst the participants in this urban periphery, but also the local cultural practices that kind of infuse it as well. However, as the book goes on, we see that this local style of play eventually has to bend to these kind of colonial or neo-colonial pressures. And this is particularly evident in the trend towards professionalization, which kind of takes over at the latter half of the book. And so what you have is, because of this distinct footballing culture, it catches the eye of some of the big Portuguese clubs. Sporting Lisboa, Benfica, Porto are all talked about, and they begin to scout the city for different players because of this, huge growth. And another thing to note is that this growth in the urban periphery in this particular style of play, it kind of drives up competition across social classes in the city, because you have these kind of upper class, well-off students who play the game as well, and they kind of start to absorb some of these more periphery practices in the way that they're playing. But overall, this interest from these professional Portuguese clubs, it starts to transform the way that games are played. And the flair and the quote unquote malice that kind of once defined this local style of play, it becomes way more mechanical and really focused on efficiency instead of entertainment, focusing on winning the game rather than just having fun playing the game. This translates into the sheer formations that the teams line up in. And so at one point in the book, it talks about the switch to the WM formation, which is this now ancient football formation that the English exported to Portugal, and then the Portuguese brought to Mozambique. And it completely changed the way that the game was played in these little local matches. And Domingos writes that the city's players were, quote, hostage to the, quote, tactical mentality. That mentality, a product of the game's commercialization, homogenized the athletes' movements, suppressing gestures and their subtle meanings, eliminating the freedom to create according to a natural and spontaneous intuition. And in talking about that, and talking the way that basically uh, the whole style of play has changed, the whole enjoyment of football stripped out of it, the author does a really good job connecting those trends to the neocolonialism of the Portuguese Estado Novo, which has this desire for the control of human bodies, even if not expressed in traditional forms. And he writes about this, quote, the tactical scheme did not have a direct ideological, moralizing, or pedagogical purpose. It was not promoted by the army, the church, or the school, and yet it disciplined bodies. And this kind of focus on bodies and the movement of bodies, is a really big focus for Domingos in this book, and one that I'm not sure he does the best job explaining and defending. Um, it's unclear sometimes exactly what he means. I think I get the point, that this kind of policing of movement is a neo-colonial expression, but I don't always get that sense super clearly. Nonetheless, we can kind of see at the latter stages of this book this turn to professionalization and the effective changing of the local style of play. Um, and we can kind of see it as the same colonial expressions of dominance and sort of this trend towards homogenization of culture. And one emblematic example of this kind of neo-colonial relationship also comes in the case of the Mozambican striker Eusebio, who's really one of the best footballers ever to live. And he cut his teeth in these very local matches that the author is documenting, only to be whisked away at quite a young age from the local club there in Lourenço Marques to the Portuguese club Benfica. And so you kind of see this extraction of talent from this urban periphery to the colonial centers of power. And the author has some other additional arguments that they make, but I think for the purpose of time, maybe now it's better to move on to some of the critiques that I had, and they'll kind of also uncover some more arguments. And really, my biggest critique of this book is just the prose. Uh, Granted, this is a translation of a work that's originally in Portuguese, so maybe this is really a critique of whoever did that translation. But for me, it was really, really difficult to read at times. The writing was very choppy and really sometimes just difficult to decipher what the author was trying to say. And I found myself reading this, particularly as a researcher of a quite similar subject matter, looking at football, politics, history, and kind of thinking to myself, if I'm not fully comprehending this, then who's the target audience? I felt like, with my own familiarity of many of these subjects, that it wasn't like I was just missing the vocabulary of, footballing terms or the game or anything else. It was just really heavily influenced by this kind of academies that's spoken throughout the book. And to the point where I really think the author misses the chance to fully flesh out some of his own points. You have these paragraph and paragraph long sentences that you're trying to track where the comma started and when the interjection came, and it does not read easily, which was disappointing. And my next big issue came in the writing about some of the author's protagonists, and namely that we don't actually hear from too many individuals who played in these games. And I know, given the time period that the author's working with, this could be difficult. But I think even if you don't have those sources to, hear directly from the players, um, any sort of oral history that you could pull out, because I'm sure that these old legends, they're local legends now, and they're talked about in these neighborhoods. If current footballers could be interviewed talking about some of these local legends, I think that would have really brought some of them to life and brought out some more vivid descriptions. But instead, we're kind of left with this very two-dimensional portrait, and this kind of ties into that first critique of it being sometimes overly academic. I just think that you could have written something that still had some excitement and life to it, because kind of ironically, this almost bended to a lot of very colonial, two-dimensional, black and white. I don't know, ways of thinking about soccer, and that was also disappointing. And really, the last thing I had was an issue with one of the huge core premises of the book, which was the development of a distinctly regional style that emerged from the suburbs of the city. And this is not me denying the existence of such a style of play or denying the existence of regional or national styles in general, but I don't see any sort of critique about how these stylizations are actually, in and of themselves, a product of colonialism, right? In a text about colonialism and football, there's no critique at all of these regional or national styles of play, which are deeply tied to colonial stereotypes as well. So, for instance, just example, the idea that Brazilian players, and particularly Afro-Brazilian players, get labeled reckless, careless, or lazy in the international press way more often than their lighter Argentine counterparts, that has everything to do with the colonial legacies that are still at play in these situations. And the author never really introduces um, a conversation about this, really a big critique of the very existence of these things, which we can talk about, but I don't know, they seemed very divorced from the possibility that they're influenced by colonialism as well. And so that was another issue I had with the text, and I guess another minor one was I didn't get a great sense of how the matches were actually happening. He makes these kind of vague gestures at, oh, this was a league match, or this match was played against a team from South Africa, or this was played by a professional club, or this was just neighborhood pickup. But you never really get a great explanation of how like leagues are set up, which seems like something it would be rather easy to find out. You don't get a great sense of how the leagues are set up or how the games are set up themselves. And so for me, that also fell a little flat. Um, I guess I'll kind of stop there. I hope I wasn't overly negative in the end. The book does, I think, some really cool things, and I think that the framing of bodily movement and the policing of that movement had some interesting possibilities. I just felt like ultimately the author is kind of short on the explanation of a lot of those things. Um, but nonetheless, yeah, I guess we can talk about this more in class. Thank you, everybody. Hope everybody's doing well. See ya.